And for anybody that just joined, this is Nicole from Fairfax County. We're just giving folks a couple minutes to get logged into Webex, and we'll get started in just a few. Just an FYI, we are recording the meeting, so please be aware of that. Thank you. All right, everybody, 35. So we're going to get the meeting kind of kicked off here. Hi, my name is Nicole Brannon. I'm a Heritage Resources Planner with Fairfax County. I am one of the people, I'm the manager for the potential historic overlay district for the Holmes Run Acres neighborhood. We're going to go through kind of all the details, and I'll give you kind of like the agenda and what's going to happen. But first, I wanted to pass it off to Supervisor Palchik for an introduction and a welcome. And like I said, we'll go over all of the WebEx concerns and how to work it right after that. And just as a note, please know that this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted up on the website after we're done. So, Supervisor Palchik.
Perfect, Nicole. And first of all, can you hear me okay? I am having, yes, okay. My internet's a little slow, so you're a little frozen in my image. As long as you can hear me, I will go ahead. All right, thank you. So first of all, I just want to thank you, Nicole, for leading this work, and for all of you for participating tonight. As you may know, this is, we're about maybe halfway through the process that began when several of the community members reached out to the Province District Office in 2019. And I believe it was my very first board matter was in January of 2020 to help begin this process officially. So many of you are here tonight from the working group that has now met 6 times to discuss and give input to staff on their analysis. As you know, staff will be using that information to make recommendations for the potential creation of a historic overlay district. And I want to thank you, Nicole, and staff, Kyra and Lily, as well as the Architecture Review Board members, Kate Orr and Samantha Wang, our 2 History Commission members, Elise Murray and Sue Kovac-Schumann, and our Planning Commissioner, Phil Najeski-Eichner, who have worked with community members in this group to bring their recommendations to the Planning Commission and on the Board of Supervisors. So I really hope that this community meeting will help to answer questions, also to clarify the process of a historic overlay district. This is the second full community meeting since the kickoff, and we will have at least one more community meeting before the recommendations are brought to our boards and to the public hearings. And so I just want to thank all of you for participating. Nicole and her team will share where they are so far, and we'll also share the timeline and the next steps, which I think are critical for the continued engagement and for you to have the information you need before final meetings are set aside. I think Nicole will share the full timeline, but at this point, we're expecting that the next full community meeting will be this summer, June or July. And if we remain on schedule, hopefully all will continue that this fall or winter, the recommendation will come before the Planning Commission and then the Board of Supervisors. And you will there again have opportunities to provide your feedback during that public hearing and feedback process. So I want to turn it back to our staff who have done really an incredible job to introduce what is a historical overlay district, to go over the details, to provide information, and to answer questions to the working group. So I really appreciate all the work you've put into this, and to really understand what the update is and what the schedule and next steps will be for the community. So I will be on at minimum for the beginning of this meeting, but I also want to thank Vanessa Simpson from my office, who's been participating in the group and will be here and hearing your questions and your thoughts as well. So with that, we'll turn it back to you, Nicole. Thank you so much, and please take it away.
Thank you, Supervisor Palchak. And so I was told that my video is a little slow, so I apologize. So I'm going to stop my video and I'm going to pop up the presentation. I'm still here, but we will get that going for you. So just give me 1 second. I appreciate everyone's patience with these kind of formats. Obviously, we are all new to this, especially, I mean, I've run some meetings, but of course, this is not the in-person thing that I think we all would like to do. So let me share my screen. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I know that there was some confusion and some issues earlier with the link, and so we're going to take that into account tonight. If at the end of the meeting it seems like we didn't get enough people participating, or we get a lot of emails saying I wasn't able to get on, we're definitely going to look at that and make sure that we're reaching out again, even before maybe the next community meeting that Supervisor Palchak was just talking about. So we want to make sure that that we're able to reach everybody as much as we can. And I know this year has been difficult for everybody, and so we want to make sure that we're taking that into account, because obviously technology is different for everybody, including myself. Webex is kind sometimes. Okay, so we're going to go over the features of Webex first, just right after this. I'm going to just kind of go over the agenda. So staff presentation, we're going to go into a little bit of background, how we got here. Some folks I know on the call have been involved in this for since the beginning, but some folks are probably new, and some folks just haven't been as in the loop maybe as I wanted to be. And we want to make sure that we're kind of resetting where we're at and make sure that everybody knows what we're doing, where we're at, and that we are in that data gathering phase, and that no decisions have been made. And we'll go through everything that we've done so far to make sure that everybody understands exactly where we are. That will include the current analysis. We'll talk about the work group and kind of the work that we've done with them and what we'll be doing in the future. And we will touch on obviously how an HOD could affect a property owner. As I mentioned, some folks have probably made it to the last community meeting, but you know, obviously that was late 2019 and a lot has changed in then. And I think it's a really good point to stop and kind of talk about where we're at and what we're doing, and to make sure that we are hearing from the community at large. And we'll talk about timelines and our next steps. I'll go through some of the frequently asked questions that we get fairly often from different folks. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers, and I'll explain in just a second how we're going to do that. And then we will conclude the meeting at 8:30. If we don't get to a question or an answer that you need to know, we're planning on making sure we copy all the questions that will be entered. I've gotten some via email for folks that couldn't make it tonight. And we'll make sure to put all of those up there on our website. And that way you can see the same questions that everybody's asked with the exact same answer. So All right. So Webex, I know everybody's probably had their fair share of different virtual platforms. So ours is Webex. So during this presentation, questions will be monitored and relayed by staff in the order they're received and as much as we can at the end of presentation. So to ask a question in Webex, you should see on the bottom right of your screen, there should be a little chat bubble. If you just click on that, you're able to type in your question to staff. And like I said, they'll be monitoring it. That way we'll see, hopefully, if we've answered the questions maybe during the presentation, or if people are asking duplicate, ask your specific one if somebody else has asked it also. But we'll read them aloud, so they'll be on the video, which is also, as I mentioned, being recorded. So that way, if anybody isn't able to make the meeting or you want to go back and hear the question and answer again, you'll have that ability too. The other function, so if you're not able to, some folks may be calling in or they aren't comfortable talking in this format online. There's also the raise hand function. So you should have a spot where it says attendee on your on the right hand side and underneath the panelists. If you click on that, you should see your name if you do the drop down. It's very tiny, and I apologize. This is Webex. At the very bottom right, there's a teeny tiny hand. If you click on that, that will raise the hand, and staff will be able to see that. And so we'd like to do a little test. If folks could type something into the chat real quick to see if that's working for us, and if staff let me know if that's working, and then also if some folks could raise their hands, that would be great. I just saw Jenny Siegler, that's great. Awesome, Steve. Great. Awesome. Okay. I'm chatting. Awesome. And will staff let me know? I see one hand raised. When I'm sharing my for me to see everything. So if somebody in staff could let me know if hands are being raised, that would be great.
Some hands are being raised.
Okay, great. So everybody hopefully has been able to see that. The other fun thing about the raise hand function is we cannot undo it. So when we get to the question and answer portion, and if you raise your hand to talk, we will then unmute you. Staff is going to be watching that. You'll have the floor to speak, give us comments, ask questions, get clarifications. Once we're done, we will ask you to unraise your hand when you're finished. We might need to do some reminders, but trust me, it's all of us that keep forgetting because that hand is very, very tiny. All right, so hopefully everybody's comfortable as they can be with Webex, and we will get started. So again, if you have any questions,
have everyone unraise their hand too right now.
Oh yes, if you have your hand raised, thank you, Kira. If you have your hand raised, if you could click on that little hand again, that would be fabulous. Hopefully that's working. We'll do another reminder of how this all works at the end when we get to the Q&A portion of the talk, so don't worry about that at all. All right. So thanks again, everybody, for attending. I know that, again, like I said, this is not our preferred format, or maybe it is for some folks who would like to attend these meetings from the comfort of their own home. So we'll go into a little bit of background of how we got here. So Holmes for Acres, as probably a lot of you know, was constructed between 1951 and 1958. It was constructed by the Luria brothers, the architects, and they followed that pattern of trying to build different kind of mid-century homes. After World War II, a lot of places kind of did the cookie cutter, maybe colonial revival, and they would go into an area, kind of bulldoze it, flatten it, and they would build the same house over and over again. And so the Luria brothers, along with their developers, decided that they wanted to do something different. They wanted more modern looking homes, and they also wanted to use kind of a standardized format, but that could be adopted for different structures. It was quickly realized that this was a very interesting and historic neighborhood. Generally, in historic preservation and history after the National Register of Historic Places, sites don't usually get listed until they're maybe at least 50 years old. But you can see that I said it was an important neighborhood and listed on our inventory of historic sites in 1977. It was then listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2007. And part of the reason that I understand that this happened was because folks had started talking about possibly creating a county historic overlay district. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at if the neighborhood is significant and can be listed on the National Register of Historic Sites. As I understand, the National Register listing was done by the Holmes Run Acres Civic Association. And the National Register nomination provides the historic context, the period of significance, and identifies the defining historic characteristics for the neighborhood. However, as folks know, the National Register is only honorific. There's no regulations that go along with it. So while a National Register listing brings a little bit of information and elevates it, there's nothing that anybody could or couldn't do to maybe stop a demolition or, you know, change whatever was being constructed in the neighborhood. And I know over the last so many years, and not just in the last 2 years, that different members of the community had talked about possibly doing a historic overlay district. I know that they met with one of my predecessors a number of years ago and had a community meeting. And it only seems in the last few years that kind of the ball got rolling a little bit faster. And so they approached the previous supervisor office in 2019 about the potential for a historic overlay district. And Supervisor Pelchek took up the motion and passed it with the rest of the board for staff to authorize to evaluate the potential for a historic overlay district. Sorry, there we go. I think most folks probably know this, but I want to kind of briefly go over what is a historic overlay district. And that's the definition right there that comes from the zoning ordinance. It's a zoning tool, and that's probably the best way to describe it. We have different kinds of zoning tools, obviously, in our zoning ordinance for different reasons. And the historic overlay district is there to help preserve history, but also to promote the general welfare through the identification, preservation, and enhancements of those buildings, structures, neighborhoods, which obviously Holmes Run Acres is, and places that have historic, cultural, and architectural significance. So this is just one of the ways that the county has the ability to preserve history. It doesn't mean that everything should or could be a historic overlay district. It's just one of the options that we have, and obviously one that the community asked for us to evaluate. Part of that leads to the Architectural Review Board. So the Architectural Review Board is a board made up of 11 members with expertise in architecture, history, landscape architecture, archaeology, design, that kind of stuff. And we'll go a little bit more into what happens if you go to the Architectural Review Board later. But I just wanted to point out there's the zoning ordinance, which is the historic overlay district, and then there's also the design guidelines, which is what the Architectural Review Board will use if it's determined, one, that there is a historic overlay district, and two, if somebody has to get a building permit to go to the Architectural Review Board. And again, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about when you need a building permit, if you are an HOD, and what that looks like if you go to the ARB. But the Architectural Review Board will use the design guidelines to review building permits and site plans. And what they're trying to do is ensure that new development within the district is appropriate with the historic significance. And again, we've talked a little bit about this in the past. And this is I think one of the biggest concerns that you get from any community with a historic overlay district, especially when it's your home. We're not trying to freeze anybody's home in time. We're not trying to say that you can't change your roof when you need to, or you have to use a specific material. What we're trying to do is ensure that any new development within the district is appropriate with its historic significance. The ARB will collaborate with the homeowner on the design of the proposal. That's to ensure that it doesn't negatively impact the historic visual significance of the community. The ARB reviews and approves the design or denies the design guidelines, not the Board of Supervisors. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the design guidelines in detail a little bit later. So after the board motion in January 2020, the plan was to kind of get started. And then, as we all know, the world kind of stopped for a little bit. And so it took us a while before we got going again, which kind of leads into part of the reason I think why we ended up having so much of a lag between different community meetings. Once we were able to start to get going, things that we started doing was analysis and background research using the National Register nomination form for information. It goes into what the historic historic significance of the what it identified the architecture and the community planning aspect of the mid-century neighborhood as significant, and also included specifics about the architecture in the neighborhood, which I'm sure you all can recognize. The modern style, how the houses are sited in harmony with nature. Obviously, it's very different than, like I was talking about earlier, where you have these large, 1940s subdivisions, maybe late 40s, early 50s, where they're just the same house. The street layout. Just looking at the map, right? You've got these kind of curvy streets, you've got the cul-de-sacs, and as you all know, the nature is built into the neighborhood. Some of the more specific architectural things are like the roofs, they're low sloped or gable, low sloped gable or shed, the large windows, which are obviously sited in a way that you have privacy from your neighbors, but also gives you a maximum expansion of being able to see. So what we're currently doing is we're in the data gathering phase, as I mentioned. So for the zoning ordinance, we have to look at specific things, such as current conditions, the individual. Specifically, we have to determine if there is an HOD, what structures would be contributing or non-contributing. And I will say that I think the way that we have to evaluate it per the zoning ordinance, it requires us to look at this, which sometimes comes off kind of strange because it sounds like when we're saying, well, we think these might be contributing or non-contributing, people like determination that there is a historic overlay district. But that's not the case. We just have to look at if there is an HOD, what structures would be, which ones wouldn't be. And through this analysis, if say we went through it and say 50% of them staff determined were non-contributing, then we would probably make a recommendation to the board that, well, 50% of the neighborhood is non-contributing, so it probably doesn't warrant a historic overlay district. But through our analysis, if we determine that of them are contributing, recommendation of, yes, we think that there's enough history and there's enough significance retained that there is a possibility for a historic overlay district. Although obviously us recommending a historic overlay district doesn't mean that there will be one. It's just saying that from staff's perspective as preservationists and historians, that we think there's enough integrity and enough remaining historic structures that a historic overlay district could be created. We also have to look that are likely to have an adverse effect. The simplest one and the best way to describe it is a demolition of an original Holmes Run Acres house. That's a very obvious one. And I think something that the community has seen happening. And then also in accordance with that, there's also what gets built in its place. And so part of historic, we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide about contributing and non-contributing, but when something is built in its place, or what if an addition is put on, it's working to make sure that what happens fits the character of the neighborhood. We'll also look at potential boundaries. Starting when we started this, and kind of the National Register is, a very, it's the standard for historic preservation, and National Register nomination as our base. Ooh, sorry, I just saw I'm cutting out quite a bit, so hold on a second. Let me pause for a second. I'm just going to turn off all the other internet that I can, that is next to me. So hopefully that will help. Apologize, folks. This is the problem with technology sometimes. If it was someplace the microphone wasn't working, I could just yell. It can be quite loud. So hopefully that will be better. I'll also try to slow myself down, so hopefully that my words are getting through. And again, this is being recorded, so hopefully if there are moments that you guys couldn't hear me, hopefully that will able to be seen in the video. And also at the end with the Q&A, we can make sure that if you can't hear me correctly, I'm sure somebody else can repeat what I've said to make sure that all the questions are getting answered. And so then we're also looking at potential boundaries. We're starting with the National Register boundary, as I mentioned, but we'll be looking at, as we go through our analysis and when we determine what structures we think are contributing or non-contributing, how that might adjust the boundary. And we'll look at the other things that are surrounding, like Luria Park. We also had the question of the southern portion of Executive Avenue. There's been some questions whether or not they should be included, even though they weren't built with homes makers. But because of their size and massing, they fit very similarly into the neighborhood. Again, that doesn't mean that they would end up in there. It's just something that we're going to evaluate to see if there's a benefit, if there is a historic overlay district that's warranted. But that is still a question that needs to be discussed, obviously with the community and with staff as well. The supervisor did request that we form a community work group with members of the neighborhood. We also have, I think as Supervisor Palchuk mentioned earlier, we have 2 members from the History Commission on there and 2 members from the Architectural Review Board, kind of to give us some help with background or process, especially when we're talking about the Architectural Review Board. So far, we've met 6 times and give input on staff analysis. Part of what we've done, and this is, I know a question that I've gotten from a few people is talking about the contributing or non-contributing. Somebody had asked me earlier because they paid attention and followed along with the work group. They thought we only had evaluated so many structures for contributing or non-contributing. But part of the process that we've done is that staff went through, we did field work, we went back out and we took pictures, we went back and looked at all of the permits that had been completed, and we compared them to what was determined as contributing and non-contributing in the National Register. And so what we're doing is we're looking at what has changed, have changes since 2007, had modifications that maybe rendered it non-contributing. So all of a sudden, maybe there have been additions or multiple additions that now the home doesn't look like a Holmes Run Acres home, or maybe it's been demolished and a new structure has been built up. And so what we've done though is staff went through, we looked at all of them, and there are a lot that are very obvious, right? There are some structures that have not changed at all. And so those are ones that we haven't brought to the work group because we know that they're contributing. We did kind of a test exercise in one of our first meetings with one of the roads to show them, look, do you agree? Yes. Okay. These are the ones that we thought they're questionable, and we wanted to get more input from the community to understand kind of where your level of comfort is, because obviously you are the folks that live in the neighborhood and are the ones that own the properties next however many years. We also brought some to the work group that were very obvious, either non-contributing or contributing in our mind as preservationists, but we use them as conversation pieces of what's happening in the neighborhood and what would be important to put in the zoning ordinance possibly, and also what would go into the design guidelines. And those, I'll go into a little more detail with that. But those are conversations that are still happening and will take a while, because obviously that's kind of the meat of this process. Using all this information, eventually staff will use the information to make recommendations or not creation of a potential historic overlay district. If it looks like there's still plenty of significance and plenty of contributing structures in the neighborhood, then staff would likely make a recommendation like, yes, this is what we think this potential historic overlay district could look like. These are the structures or properties that should be included. Here are the boundaries. Here are the things we think should be regulated in the zoning ordinance, and here are things that should go into the design guidelines. I think the Supervisor Palchuk mentioned earlier too, once, and I'll talk about this too when we get to the timeline, but once we get to that point where we have recommendations, we're going to come back to the community so folks can comment on that too. This is kind of more of a, where are we and what are we doing right now, kind of catch up phase. Assuming there we go. So one of the big questions that we always get in this process and the other HODs that we've talked about in the last few years is, what is a contributing versus a non-contributing resource? So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there was contributing and non-contributing determined by the National Register. And we're looking at that, but we're looking at all of them again too. We're even looking at the ones that were non-contributing. And there are non-contributing in the National Register that are very obvious. And then there are some that were like, well, you know, maybe this could still be contributing. That's what we're looking at. But a contributing resource for a homes for an acre neighborhood are those that date to the period of significance, which is the period of construction, 1951 to 1958, and they contribute to the character of the neighborhood. So this house that you see here is one of those that has not changed very much at all, right? You can see it still has its original garage, which I know is unusual and not a requirement for an HOD, but you can see that it's a Homes for an Acres house. You've got those windows, you've got the large chimney on the side, the low sloped roof, it's built into the landscaping. It very much is obviously something that would contribute to the district. A non-contributing property is not contributing because either due to its period of construction, even if it was built maybe to match the character of the neighborhood, we would still say because we don't want to recreate history. And then also other alterations or factors that do not contribute to the district's historic significance. And another question we get a lot is within an HOD, yes, both contributing for building permits. Okay, sorry, just got another mention that I'm kind of in and out. I'm gonna take a pause real quick and let me see if I can shut something else down real quick. 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. We've got multiple people in this house using internet at the moment. So hopefully that will work. I apologize if it's in and out. Again, technology is not my friend today. But within a historic overlay district, both contributing and non-contributing structures would require ARB approval for building permits. The difference would be is that if you were a non-contributing structure, brand new house, that somebody had a demo permit because there was a structure that had really bad structural issues and they had to demolish it for whatever reason, and the ARB approved the demolition of that structure. The new structure, though, would have to still come to the ARB, and the proposal would have to meet the design guidelines and the zoning ordinance. Again, it doesn't mean that we're looking for somebody to construct a house that looks like exactly like a Homes for an Acres house, but more that will fit into the character and the style of the neighborhood. So, Lily, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lily Gazoo with the Zoning Administration Division. Because we're having problems with our voices coming in and out, I'll just turn off my video. I just wanted to say good evening, and then I'll start my presentation. So I will briefly go over the different components that are required to create or establish a historic overlay district. I am the planner who is working on two of the three components that are required. And the three components are the zoning ordinance amendment, comprehensive plan amendment, and rezoning application. The zoning ordinance amendment portion will create new regulations with emphasis on the protection of existing features of historic significance that are identified as part of this analysis that we're doing within the proposed historic overlay district. From the research and analysis, we will draft a zoning ordinance language that will include district-specific purpose, as well as additional use standards and development standards or bulk regulations. And for example, in looking at the standards, one of the development standards or bulk regulation is height. In the R3 zoning district, where this proposed historic overlay district is located, height is limited to 35 feet for single-family dwellings and 60 feet for all other structures. Part of our analysis will consider if the height should be kept the same or keep the height limit for all structures at 35 feet, consistent with the single-family dwelling height limit, or should we propose some other height limitation? Staff is aware that changes that are included in the zoning ordinance sometimes may not provide the flexibility to make changes if, for example, a proposed limitation cannot be met due to topographical or other impediments a property may have. And property owners may not have, may have additional issues with the creation of the historic overlay district. Staff does not want to freeze, as Nicole mentioned earlier. Staff is not looking at freezing the neighborhood or structure in time, but rather help property owners design any proposed changes to better fit the character of the neighborhood and while still allowing them to make the changes that they want. Recommendations that are not included in the zoning ordinance then will be included in the design guidelines, which will be used by the ARB in reviewing proposals within the historic overlay district. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, there are two other components that are required. The comprehensive plan is a planning tool for decision-making process regarding the natural and built environment. And the comprehensive plan mentions listings on inventory of the historic sites and National Register of Historic Places, for example, and encourages the preservation of an area or a structure. The amendment to the comprehensive plan will reflect this, and it will reflect the historic overlay district designation in the comprehensive plan. And then the last component is the rezoning application, which is another part of the series of actions required to establish the boundaries of the historic overlay district. Since a historic overlay district is actually a zoning district, the establishment of the historic overlay district requires the Board of Supervisors to approve a rezoning application to rezone the property into the historic overlay district and amend the actual zoning map, the official zoning map, to create the boundaries of the district. I would like to note that the rezoning of the property to a historic overlay district does not change the underlying zoning district, which is R3, but it would add this additional protection of historic overlay district, and it will require ARB review for properties within that district. With that, I conclude my presentation and turn it back to Nicole.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a couple things here because obviously my audio has not been helpful. So if you guys give me a second, if one of the staff could let me know if they can hear me better. I took off my headphones, which were supposed to help. If it sounds better now. Staff, anyone?
Yes, it sounds better.
Yeah. Okay, good. See, this is what I get for trying something new. Thank you, Lily. Yeah, and if you guys have, as we get through this, Lily's been working with Laura, our branch manager, who's also on the call, with the Holland Hills potential HOD, which I think some of you know about also. So if we have questions, Lily's been working on this for a long time. So the zoning questions, she has great answers to. So, oh, I feel so bad that my headphones were the problem, you guys. So So what could an HOD mean for your property? A big thing is it does not apply to interior alterations. So if you're renovating your kitchen, if you're redoing your bathrooms, your bedrooms, all of that, we do not regulate that at all. We would never see a permit. We wouldn't know it was happening. That is the normal process that you would go through. Any existing renovations can also remain. So if you have an addition, if you've enclosed your carport, that doesn't mean that makes you automatically like not contributing. Those are things that we would take into account, and we'll look at the structure as a whole. The underlying zoning, R3, remains in place. So we're not changing any of the things that come with R3, although we may put, as Lily kind of mentioned, other things on there, possibly height. But again, those are things we take deeply into account. ARB approval would be required before a building permit can be issued. Again, this applies to the larger exterior renovations, construction or demolition, and I have a abbreviated list I'm going to show you in just a bit. ARB review and recommendation would also be required before a site plan or developer in 10 years bought 20 properties somehow and wanted to do a rezoning. The ARB would have to review and make recommendations on that. And so that would be part of the HOD. So here is an abbreviated list for when a permit is required that would end up going to
Hi, Nicole. This is Laura. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm not seeing the slide that you're talking about.
Oh, you're not? Hold on. There we go.
Thank you.
So a permit is required for new buildings, additions, and structures, porches and decks, sheds and playhouses over 250 square feet, swimming pools, retaining walls over 3 feet, new exterior stairs or stoops, and as I mentioned previously, demolition of buildings and structures. A permit is not required for fences, window replacements, residential door replacements, gutters, playground equipment, on-grade patios, driveways. As it's noted at the visit our Land Development Services webpage, LDS, for a complete list if there's more that you'd like to know about. And also alterations for ARB review may be added or removed from the list depending on staff analysis. We do have the ability for some things to be what we call administratively reviewed. So something that a building permit may come in for some HODs, and based on what's written into the zoning ordinance for that HOD, maybe it's a deck off of a newer structure that's not visible from any contributing structure, not visible from a contributing roadway, and we can tell that that's not going to affect anything in the HOD. And so then it doesn't take us very long, and you do not have to go to the Architectural Review Board. Sorry, now my thing's not advancing. There we go. So this is just a simple slide showing the Architectural Review Board process. So you would apply for a site plan, which would have to meet all the normal county regulations. If it was within if there was, and you were determined to be within it, you would consult with Heritage Resources staff, myself, or somebody else. As I mentioned, we could do determine, say it was an addition, it would go to a full ARB review. You would submit your ARB application, and that would mean you would go to the ARB meeting for recommendation and decision. The ARB does meet monthly, just once a month, so it could potentially add time onto the process. I do want to make that clear. Generally, the ARB tries very hard to work as much as they can with the applicant. They haven't denied a permit. I believe I have the information in 15 years, and Laura can correct me if I'm wrong on that. They may ask you to come back for another meeting to work on the details, but they don't want to deny permits, and they want to make sure that you're able to, in the way that you need, while also still meeting the historic integrity of the neighborhood. Once you've gone to the ARB and you've gotten approval, when you come in for your permit, your final permit, Heritage Resources staff will do a conformance check. So we're going to make sure that the plans that you submitted to the ARB match what you're submitting for your final permit. We're all in agreement. It goes through the building permit, site plan, and approved through the normal process. So we're just going to do a brief example of an HOD that we have existing, and this is Woodlawn, which is located in Alexandria along Route 1. And obviously, this is very different than a suburban neighborhood, and we've talked about that a lot before, internally and at the work group, because our HODs were all created a long time ago, the ones that are existing, and they are very different than a suburban neighborhood. We are learning a lot through the Holland Hills process. They're a bit ahead of us in this process. And so while this is an example of an HOD and how it kind of works, obviously it's not a one-for-one example. So I just want to make sure we take that into account. Woodlawn consists of the plantation itself, the George Washington Gristmill, the Pope Leahy House, among other historic properties. One of the big defining features for Woodlawn is its view shed. You can see that's why it's got this big giant buffer around it. It's unlikely for a historic neighborhood that we would include a giant view shed. Obviously, there's not, you know, if you're right up on Gallows Road, obviously you're right up on Gallows Road, and that's what you're looking at. And where Woodlawn is up on this hill, and you're looking down into the valley, and you're looking to where the gristmill used to be, that HOD. So for the Woodlawn HOD, the regulations in the zoning ordinance and use limitations. So that means the location of residential and commercial uses, and there's no industrial. It also requires the compatibility of new design with historic sites, and new improvements shall be compatible with historic sites for impacts. The current R1 zoning for Woodlawn, obviously you guys are R3, mandates the lot size, minimum yards density, and open space requirements. So again, that would be the same thing. So whatever the R3 zoning district mandates, that is going to. So we've talked a little bit about the design guidelines. We've kind of touched on them and how the ARB process when they're evaluating any permits. We have hired a consultant called EHT Trade to do the draft design guidelines. And I know that they did some work actually of helping with the National Register nomination in 2007. So Sarah Vonish is on the call. Sarah, do you want me to give you the thing?
I'm sorry. Nicole, unless you have my slides, you can give me the slide share capability and I'll pull them up.
I sure can.
I just wanted to turn. Okay. I wanted to pull up my. All right, we're good.
Yeah.
Pulling up my video so that you could all see my face and put a face to the name. I'll stop my video and hopefully you can all hear me okay, right?
Yes, I can hear you, and I'm
Okay.
switching to you right now. So Sarah, as you are ready, it is all yours.
All right, so I'm hoping it came up. Everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So hi again, I'm Sarah Vonish. I'm a historic preservation specialist and project manager with EHT Traceries. We're a Washington, D.C. based historic preservation consulting firm, certified woman-owned business founded in 1977. We specialize in archival research, survey, documentation, resource evaluations, regulatory compliance, and preservation planning. We have a staff of architectural historians, and planners, all who meet the professional qualifications of the Secretary of the Interior. And I'm joined by our principal, Laura Hughes, and architectural historian, Catherine Wallace. I just want to say we're very much in the beginning of this process. So I'm going to give you an introduction to the design guidelines, but we will be back later on with some draft materials for your review and for us to review together if you have additional questions and comments at that time. So we'll be back. So the project goals for the design guidelines is to create user-friendly and graphically interesting design guidelines to provide guidance to homeowners and applicants, DPD staff, the ARB, and neighborhood and community members to promote the preservation and rehabilitation of the homes in the HOD, potential HOD. So we've been working with DPD staff and the ARB for over a year now, almost 2 years, on updating the existing design guidelines for the current 13 historic overlay districts, as well as Holland Hills and the Wellington at River Farm potential HOD. We're also preparing some overall general design guidelines to help applicants understand the review process and the general design principles that you should keep in mind when planning a project within an HOD and involving a historic resource. And here are just the covers of what is to come. So again, as I mentioned, we're in the very first phase. We're developing the draft design guidelines in consultation with staff and the work group. We've attended one work group meeting and we'll continue to do so until we have a draft ready for public input and review. So we'll continue with the drafts, and then ultimately, pending designation of Holmes Run Acres as an HOD, we'll finalize the HOD design guidelines with the ARB and with the ARB's approval. So the purpose of design guidelines, they outline recommendations and not requirements. The requirements are really handled in the zoning. They are intended to support the community's continued effort to preserve and celebrate and evolve over time. They are not meant to be absolute or give case-specific advice if for a specific project need or a specific site limitation. And they provide guidance that's well aligned with basic preservation standards to help applicants design and execute projects that retain character-defining features and preserve the character of the HOD. And sometimes a creative, thoughtful solution, one that's not clearly outlined in the design guidelines, will be the most appropriate solution. And that's where the ARB in consultation with them comes into play. And these bullet points just give you an idea of what guidelines do and don't. And I think Nicole covered them pretty well. So that's all I have. Again, as I mentioned, we'll be back with draft guidelines. I will tell you that they cover the existing building, the landscape, streetscape, and archaeology. They're outlined to provide recommendations for preserving existing buildings, and they're outlined as recommended and not recommended treatments. There's guidelines for additions and new construction within the HOD, and then guidelines for preserving the landscape and especially the connection between the landscape and the homes in the district. So with that, I will hand it back to Nicole, and we'll take any of your questions at the end.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just going to grab back the presenter mode, and I'm going to share my screen one more time as we head towards the end of the presentation, and then we'll get towards the comments and questions. Just as a note, if you are sending question through the chat, try to make sure that your drop down arrow, there's like a little list that you're sending it to everyone. We've gotten some, but I know that some have just been sent to me, which is totally fine, but just it'll help make sure that we are able to see all the questions if everybody that is staff can see them here tonight. So this is our timeline. We got a little bit there in the beginning. So as I mentioned earlier, our first meeting was way back in November 2019. Seems like a different world now. The board motion passed January 14th, 2020. And that's kind of when things, obviously, as we all know, kind of started to slow down and halt. So we realized we could do site visits socially distant in April and May. So we did that. That's when we went out, took the photographs, and also compared that to the National Register nomination and any permits that we had in our archives to see what had changed over the years. In the meetings in September, and as I mentioned, we met once a month for those 6 months. Tonight, obviously, we're here at the second community meeting. So going forward, which is obviously, I think, what everybody really wants to know about. So over the next few months, we're going to do additional staff and work group meetings to review draft zoning language and design guidelines. The next month or so will be staff taking all the information that we've got so far, like I mentioned, the data gathering, and we'll start determining for staff what we think are contributing and non-contributing resources. We'll work with Lily and zoning and other staff members to come up with draft zoning language. We'll work with traceries and the work group to determine design guidelines. And then we'll work through those things, like I mentioned, with the work group. And eventually, in June and July, as Supervisor Palachek said, if everything keeps moving along at an appropriate speed, we'll have another meeting to present the draft zoning ordinance and design guidelines to the community. And that will be, we'll make sure that those get sent out well before the meeting, and then we'll make sure that people have time to look at them and review them, because it turns out to be a lot of information, especially the list of contributing and non-contributing. But I do want to make that clear too. I think I've mentioned it once or twice, but we haven't made any determinations yet. So there's, like I said, we started with the National Register nomination, and we're looking at what they determine contributing and non-contributing, but we're looking at what's changed since then. And if there's any that maybe they said were non-contributing that we disagreed with, or vice versa. And so that will be probably the most important point for the community, is when we have what we think are our draft recommendations, because that's when we need to know, did we get it right? Did we make it so that it's a cohesive, if there is a historic overlay district there, is it cohesive? Does it make sense to the community? And as Lily kind of touched on with the zoning regulations, the county doesn't want to make things super restrictive, right? We don't want to make something so that people don't want to be in a historic overlay, really serve anybody's purpose. So we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful, and what we're suggesting or recommending to the board for approval makes sense for the community and not just for us. Once we get past that, on what comments we get, any additional information that we receive from the community or from staff, we will aim for going to the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisor public hearings in the fall and or winter. And those will be public meetings also. So these are some of the big questions that we've gotten over this year or so about the HOD, the potential HOD and what it's like. So is there a fee associated with the HOD or the ARB process? No, there's not. So if there is a Homes Run Acres HOD, there's no extra permitting fee to go to the ARB. There's just the normal county fees and regulations for that. What if I disagree with an ARB decision? There is an appeals process that's laid out in the zoning ordinance. Again, however, the ARB will work with the homeowner and architect to develop a design that is mutually acceptable. There's not been an appeal in over 15 years. So if you do wish to appeal, though, you may appeal to the Board of Supervisors directly. And if in an HOD, if we ever got to that point, staff like myself or somebody else in Heritage Resources would help you work, that you know what it says in the zoning ordinance, and make sure that we are working with you to make sure we could fix that. Will ARB review add time to my process? It depends. I'm not going to pretend that if there is an HOD that adding an ARB meeting to it won't add time to your process. It definitely can. As I mentioned earlier, there are ways for some things that hopefully we can add administrative review to the process, so that would come in with the building permit. We would review it at the same time zoning's reviewing it, anybody else in Fairfax County that has to review it. And so hopefully there's certain things that we can administratively review and not make it more complicated. However, larger renovations like additions, they will require attendance at least one ARB meeting, and depending on how complicated it is or agreements such that they may happen, maybe 2 meetings or more. Generally, most applicants that I've seen do 1 to 2 meetings at the most. There is the occasional one that takes a couple more meetings, but that is, I would say, rare. Can I use any type of tax credits if my home is historic? So if your home is listed in the National Register of Historic Places as a contributing structure to the historic district, then you get rehabilitation tax credits. And that's a separate process through the state. But so if you are looking for that information, I can definitely help you get directed to their website, and they have some great people too. Is the permit process for the county different than the certification process for tax credits? So if you were doing tax credits, then yes, the ARB uses the county developed zoning ordinance and design guidelines for the decision. However, sometimes they have very similar concerns, but they may have different requirements. But the ARB would definitely work through you with that. We definitely have had that in the past. What other opportunities will I have to comment? Obviously, this community meeting tonight and our work group meetings is going forward. We'll make sure that we're getting that information out to you guys. So if you want to listen in, you can definitely email me and I'll have my contact information at the end. But letters also to staff, or if you know somebody on the work group, please feel free to email them and they can put information along to me. And again, once we get to the public comment at the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisor hearings, I would say that the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors in something like this will definitely want to hear from the property owners, residents of Holmes Run Acres. While staff is making their recommendation based on the historic significance, and this is a process that only works if people are in favor of it, which is why there was a survey in the beginning to determine if people did want to look at this evaluation. So, and is an HOD the same as an HOA? No, not at all. We cannot regulate anything that's not in the zoning ordinance. Obviously, HOAs can ask you for specific paint colors or a certain type of material, or you can only have this high of grass or plants. The county can't do that. So while we will in the design guidelines make recommendations for materials, for colors, we cannot require that from county residents. So that is very much different than an HOA. Okay, I've been seeing questions. Thank you guys so much for doing that. So we'll just go over real quick again. So the questions have been monitored by staff, and I'll make sure that I go through because I know that I got some, but I think folks have relayed them also to all panelists, which is great. So folks, if you want to ask a question in the chat function, and I will answer that. Evelyn is going to read them out loud. Also, again, once we get through all the ones in, we'll ask if folks want to raise their hand and we can unmute you, and then you can have the floor to ask your question in person. And again, if at any point, again, I'll have at the very end, I'll put up my email and my phone number. So if you don't feel comfortable in the chat or in the phone number, please feel free to email me or call me. I'm happy to talk about this at any time. So, so Evelyn, do you have questions for me?
The first question, if upper executive is included, would they be eligible as contributing structures or non-contributing?
So yeah, so upper executive, or that one always confuses me because it's the southern end of executive, but it is up the hill. So so executive drive would, in my estimation at this point, because they are not part of the Holmes Run Acres neighborhood, they would likely be non-contributing, which is kind of, it would lend itself to asking, should they be included, right? Because they're not part of the neighborhood. Some of the things that we've spoken about at the work group is, and I think why we were originally requested to look at that was because folks see it as kind of a buffer. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to create like a giant view shed buffer because I don't think a suburban neighborhood, at least in this area, generally warrants it. But obviously, if those houses were not part of the HOD, they would have the ability to get demolition permits and build, you know, larger structure next to Holmes Run Acres houses. So we're looking at it. They are not part of the original Holmes. Next question.
Do all additions / projects need to go before the ARB or just the ones that face the street?
So it depends, I guess I should say. Through this process, if we determine things that, like I mentioned, could be administratively reviewed. So often in the other HODs, what it is if, say you're putting a deck, like I said, on the back of your house, and it can't be seen from another contributing property or a contributing resource, then we could probably administratively review it, so it would not need to go to the ARB. But otherwise, if you were putting an addition on or a deck or anything like that, then yes, you would likely need to go to the.
Okay, next question. Do you know how many permit applications came before the ARB for review in the past 15 years?
Ooh, that's a good question. Laura, she's been doing some of this research for Holland Hills. Do you know off the top of your head? I know you've.
I know we've done it for Holland Hills, and they have about, this is a general guesstimate, but they have about 450 properties, and in our analysis, we only had about 9 building permits that rose to the level of getting an architectural review, board review. But I can't say the number of building permits for the ARB total. There are 13 different historic overlay districts now. And a building permit, we probably have, I'd probably say average of 1 a month. So that would probably be 100 or so total.
Thank you, Laura. Next question, Evelyn.
We received a map of contributing and non-contributing houses. Are the non-contributing houses examples of those that will be rejected by the ARB? Will reasons for non-contributing assessments be provided?
Yes. So those non-contributing ones, as I mentioned earlier, on the National Register, and kind of what we touched on earlier is the characteristics that they determined and are very similar to what we're looking at for non-contributing. And yes, if for the structures, so that will be, like I said, what we're going through now is taking all the information that we've gotten and making our determinations for what would be contributing in the historic overlay district for Fairfax County. And once we have that information, we'll be sending that back out to everybody, making it public, and we'll make sure that there will be a reason why we've determined it non-contributing. And real quick, I got a question to just me that wanted to know if we can see who's on here. I mentioned earlier at the very beginning of the meeting that I know that there were some issues with the link that had gone out in some forms that wasn't working. And so we're going to make sure after tonight, we're going to check back in. We're going to see how many people that we have. And I'm going to reach back out to the community and make sure that we didn't miss a lot of people. If we did, we're going to double back and make sure that if we need to have another meeting, something like this, or if I need to have phone calls with folks individually, we make sure that we're reaching everybody. So yeah, we're looking into that too. So Evelyn, next question.
Yeah, Nicole, there are a couple of comments about your audio dropping a little bit. So I don't know if maybe if you stop presenting, if that might help.
Stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay. The next question. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So Sarah Vanish mentioned the connection between land and home in HRA. This connection is critical. Look at the first red house you put up on the screen, for example. With Zeeman's loosening of accessory structures code, this connection is threatened. Can the HOD require that we keep existing code, i.e., is this something that could go into zoning that ties to the property, or would it only be relegated to the guidelines?
Okay, I'm going to ask Lily to jump in here. What I will say is from the HOD side of it, obviously if somebody is going to start, if CMOD passes, and there is an HOD in place, obviously any building permit, so if somebody is putting in a accessory living unit, an ALU, that would still have to come forward to the Architectural Review Board for review. But I will let Lily talk to the actual zoning side of that.
That's correct, Nicole. Any changes that may be proposed as part of ZMOD would be applicable countywide, so it would be applicable to this area as well. For it would not exclude existing HODs or new HODs, unless there's a specific limitation, either use limitation or development standard that is found as part of this review and analysis that needed to be included in the zoning ordinance, and exclude the proposed HOD. So that would be something we will look at if it's found to be an impact to the HOD, specifically to this HOD in terms of its overall setting and design.
Thank you, Lily. I'm going to pop in real quick, Evelyn, because I got another question that was sent to me just ready. At what stage does the community vote to approve or disapprove of the proposed HOD, if at all? Is it a majority or supermajority? That's a great question. That there's not a specific answer to that. Generally, from my understanding in the county, we don't have people vote on like the overall community. However, what we've seen in the past for these HODs, and again, these are the first new HODs we've proposed in a long time, is that we may do a survey out to the community asking for just the general understanding of preferences. I can't say that a vote either way would swing it. Again, I think that from staff's perspective, we're obviously recommending it based on the historic integrity. But the Planning Commission makes a recommendation, and the Board of Supervisors, who is the ultimate decider, is going to take into account everything, especially the community's position on that. So I'll make sure to work with other staff and the supervisor's office to make sure that once we have our recommendations for a zoning ordinance, draft design guidelines, and an HOD, we're reaching back out to everybody, and not just the community meeting, but in another way to make sure that we're capturing all the different opinions for that. All right, Evelyn, next question.
Are full permit drawings required, or is it possible to speed up the process by meeting with the ARB at the concept drawing stage?
Yeah, for sure. Different ways to meet with the ARB. The one that we've mostly been talking about is what we would call an action item, and that and the ARB looks at it, reviews it, and makes a decision to approve or to deny, or to ask for more information. But there is the option to come earlier whenever you feel like it. So if you're just getting your architectural drawings done, you've just hired an architect permit, you can come to the ARB and do what's called a workshop. They'll look at your plans, they'll look at your all the questions, and they'll give you recommendations. So that way, when you are ready to apply for the permit, you can come, they've seen everything, they've made their concerns known, and generally move through fairly quickly. And I did get another question too. I'm just going to mention this one. Somebody said, you mentioned something about preserving integration of the structures with the surrounding environment. Do I have to file paperwork and seek approval for moving a problematic tree? That's a very broad statement, so any level of specifics would be appreciated. Yeah, also a great question. No, we cannot, in a historic overlay district, require you to come to the ARB for the removal of a tree. That obviously is not, there are, I think, specific just zoning regulations about tree removal, and I'm not gonna claim to know what those are. But if you were proposing an addition to your structure and you were removing a tree or say like a large amount of vegetation, during that process with the ARB, they would talk to you about obviously your addition, the architecture and that kind of stuff, but they would also, based on the design guidelines that we've determined, they would make recommendations about the landscaping and the vegetation. Again, we can't require you to save that tree in a historic overlay district, especially if it's problematic. But they would say maybe with your design, you can plant these certain trees that fit with and to kind of mitigate the loss of that tree. Evelyn, do you have the next question?
Since many of our two-story houses are built into slopes, if a two-story addition is added onto the part of the house that is on the top of the slope, it could potentially have a roof line that would be 35 feet above the house at the lowest part of the slope. Would that mean the proposed addition would not be approved?
Can you read that one more time? And Lily, would you, because it sounds very specific about zoning.
It says, since many of our two-story houses are built into slopes, if a two-story addition is added onto the part of the house that is on the top of the slope, it could potentially have a roof line that would be 35 feet above the house at the lowest part of the slope. Would that mean the proposed addition would not be approved?
So currently the height is measured from grade to the highest point of the roof for flat roofs, or to the average height between eave and the ridge for a gable or hip roof. So the current zoning ordinance does limit that height for single family dwellings to 35 feet. With this type of example, if it ends up that the addition is going to exceed that maximum 35 feet height from grade to the highest level, either the flat roof or the average of the pitch, yes, it would not be permitted. And that's something that's already in the zoning ordinance currently.
Thank you, Lily. Evelyn, next question.
Holland Hills is ahead of HRA and perhaps have draft HOD design guidelines. While a different neighborhood, can that draft be provided to HRA residents as an example?
Yes, I think so. Laura, I believe are public at this point, correct?
Yeah, we can either post them to the Holmes for Acres website, or we can send them the link. They should be on the share file.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure if we send them out, so this is just for everybody, we make sure that folks know that that's obviously for Holland Hills. If I post them on our website, I don't want folks getting confused and or worried that we've created design guidelines already, because obviously we are not there yet. So Sarah, you look like you might have something.
I was just going to add, because I didn't mention this in my presentation, but and if you're all looking at the Holland Hills guidelines, it's just something to keep in mind. The design guidelines it's a comprehensive document, and it covers a lot of different types of projects and treatments. And not all projects or not all items included in the design guidelines require a building permit and ARB review. Just recommendations on best practices, preservation practices. So just wanted to note that, but encourage everyone to look at the Holland Hills. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. I also got the question that folks are asking why we can't see the attendee list on the presentation. That might just be a Webex issue tonight. So I don't think it's a problem though. We should have a list of all the attendees and I can send that out to folks. So we can see everybody that's on there. And as I mentioned, if we get the sense that we didn't get out to enough people, we'll make sure to round back and make sure that we're getting everybody in the loop and answering all the questions possible. Evelyn, do you have another one for me?
I believe a tear down was mentioned in reference to structural defect in this meeting. Was this an example, and can an owner decide a tear down for any reason as long as the replacement meets HOD standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that's also kind of a tough one. The Architectural Review Board will want to know what the reason is for the tear down. Obviously, if there's life safety issues, that's obviously important. Nobody is going to force somebody to try to fix a house that maybe is, for whatever reason, maybe a tree's fallen into it because of weather, there's been flooding, there's mold, you know, that all gets taken into account. If somebody has a property and they just want to tear it down, I don't know if we've had, Laura might have to chime in here too. I don't know if we've had that for other HODs for historic, like a contributing property. I would say though, if they were able to do that, they would have to meet the zoning ordinance and any design guidelines that are made for homes run acres. Again, it wouldn't be recreating history and making you build an exact replica of the house, but you would have to meet with the design guidelines and the zoning ordinance. Laura, did you have something else on that one?
Yeah, Nicole, that's exactly right. So the contributing status of a structure means it has a higher level of historic integrity than a non-contributing structure. And what that means is it just has the characteristics that Nicole went through earlier for the architecture, landscape, etc. So if someone came in and wanted to demolish the structure, they'd have to have a compelling reason to do so, and they would have to get the ARB approval to demolish for the demolition permit. And if it's listed as contributing, and obviously Nicole said life safety issues, then it's going to be very difficult to demolish the structure based on, you know, no impact other than a tear down and wanting to build a new house. So that's sort of the protection that a historic overlay district would provide to the community.
Great. I've got another couple here in my chat, and maybe Evelyn, you have these too. Is the real estate tax rate different in an HOD? And is the tax basis increased on a home because it is in an HOD? I will answer that no, the county, and Laura, you've done some research on this too, but no, the county's not going to tax you differently because of an HOD. I also know that there's been questions about, and Laura's gotten these in Holland Hills, the insurance rates and stuff. And I've done a little bit of research, and I think Laura's done some more, but I know a lot of those, that comes from historic overlay districts that are very strict and do require specific materials and certain replacements. That would not be the case here because in the zoning regulations, like I said, we can't require specific materials or so like certain windows or a certain roof material. We'll recommend those, but they shouldn't increase your insurance because you would be able to replace them with normal materials that you would otherwise. Laura, did you have any other thoughts on that?
No, just to agree that, you know, there's no tax implications for being placed in a historic overlay district. It does go on the tax record. And to buffer Nicole's discussion about the insurance rates, as she said, it really does become a material cost. And that is something that is negotiable with the ARB once you bring your project forward. So if you have wood, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be replaced with wood. We recommend wood, but if you can't for whatever financial reasons, etc., that's something that can be mitigated with the ARB.
Thanks, Laura. Evelyn, do you have another one for me?
This one is a comment in response to the tear down question. Micah, who asked the tear down question, stated that he asked the question at the last meeting and he was told yes last time.
Yes, that he could tear down if he wanted to. Is that correct?
Okay.
Yeah, I guess you can't tell me that. Well, I guess probably the answer, Laura's popping on here too. Again, Laura, do you have a better an answer for that?
I was just going to say, you can propose a tear down for any reason, but your demolition permit, which is regardless if you're in a historic overlay district or not, has to be approved by the Architectural Review Board. And your demolition permit can't be processed until you have the Architectural Review Board approval. So that would be kind of the restriction that would allow. Now, saying if you got the approval from the ARB, then by all means, please move forward. But you have to get that demolition permit approved by the ARB before you move forward. That's one of the protections, again, of the historic overlay district.
Another question that I got is, may a prior addition be required to come under compliance of HOD guidelines if a new addition is planned? No. So if you've got an addition on there and you're putting another that, we are not going to require you to change anything that's already been done. If there's an opportunity, ARB may be like, hey, we would love it if you did this, but no, we will not be able to require that at all. Evelyn, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, there are two more in the chat. The first one is, do you have to have architectural drawings? What if you don't hire an architect, but you've just hired a contractor to enclose a carport or do a small extension?
Yeah, so basically for that kind of stuff, they would have to submit very similar things for the building permit. And so that would be the same thing. If for some reason it's generally the more complicated things that we would need specific architectural drawings, but the contractor and Laura may be able to comment on this too. But if you're enclosing a carport, whatever drawings that you're submitting for the building permit would probably suffice for the Architectural Review Board.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Nicole. The building permit is, we try not to make it over and above what you would have to submit for a building permit requirement if you were not in a historic overlay district. They do ask for some additional materials, sometimes elevation, sometimes photographs of the existing property to give some context, and an application form and a couple other things, but nothing overly onerous above and beyond of what you would normally have to do for a building permit application.
Okay. I also have a question, why is only half the pool included? The pool consists of 2 parcels on Gallows Road. I will say that is probably a mistake. We have realized that we've had some competing boundaries because we've got the National Register nomination, the historic sites. So what I will say to that is, again, we haven't determined any boundaries yet, and we're going to be looking at all of that and reaching out to those other owners of the pool. We're talking to Fairfax County Public Schools. We'll talk to the Park Authority. So we're going to look into all of that, and when we get to the point again this summer for recommendations on the zoning ordinance, design guidelines, and the boundaries, we'll reach back out to you guys and give you all that information. So Evelyn, do you have any? You said you had another one?
Yeah, there are now 2 more questions in the chat. The next one, he was unable to hear your response earlier because the audio cut out. And it states, if a house is classified as non-contributing, will alterations of that nature be prohibited by the ARB in the future? For example, use of glass blocks seems to be a marker for non-contributing homes. Will I be able to use them in an alteration?
Yeah, no. Just because something was determined non-contributing, especially if we're talking about National Register, that doesn't mean that those things specifically will make a new addition or proposed alteration non-contributing. Again, it would end up being a conversation with the Architectural Review Board, and they would probably work with you on the design. So if you wanted something with glass block, they would probably try to figure out how to make it work within the characteristics of the neighborhood and using the design guidelines. So yeah, it's a possibility that things that may seem to have made something non-contributing be used. I think a lot of times what is contributing, it's kind of a greater than its parts kind of thing. So there's a lot of changes that have happened that maybe have made the structure to be determined. So Evelyn, did you have any more?
Yeah, one more, let's see. there are two more questions. The next one states, can design guidelines include specific language about exterior landscaping, i.e. a decorative dry stone retaining wall under 3 feet in a front yard, a statue of a Greek god? And then the other question is, are there county laws prohibiting removal of all trees on a lot?
Yeah, Sarah, you just popped on for design guidelines, so I'm going to let you, if you want to answer that one, and then we'll get back to the trees.
Sure, and you'll see this in the Holland Hills design guidelines if you take a look. There's a section on the landscape and streetscape and archaeology, and what we've tried to do is provide a lot of images and describe the character and the historic character of the landscape, and provide recommendations for what types of materials to use, such as, you know, concrete, the materials that you see within the district today, and then outline not recommended materials such as, or treatments such as expansive parking pads, concrete parking pads, or things that would draw away from the landscape without giving specific requirements or recommendations for keeping your wall under 3 feet. So I think just highlighting the existing character, the historic character, and what types of recommended actions would fit within that character without mentioning a Greek god or something, if that answers. I can't answer about the tree, so.
Art, one more time, please.
I just said I can't answer about the removal of the tree.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted, Evelyn, if you could just read that tree part again. I think that was more directed at the county.
Yeah, it states, are there county laws prohibiting removal of all trees on a lot?
I don't believe so. Laura, I look like you might know more about that than me.
Yeah, that's okay. So there are specific provisions about protecting trees with new developments. But for historic overlay districts, as we've done with Holland Hills, we recommended the landscaping as part of the unique nature of the historic overlay district. And so we could encourage the existing landscaping and other existing historic overlay districts that are being reviewed by the ARB now. They do take into account if trees have been the existing trees, because every time you take down a tree, you're impacting the view shed. So that's part of the bigger issues that's there. We can't regulate one specific tree coming down. That's not within the purview of the zoning ordinance in the historic overlay district.
And Evelyn, is there one more question?
Yeah, there's one more question in the chat. If someone ignored this whole process and built without a permit, as has happened in the past, would the county give priority to a case in an HOD and issue a tear down order?
Yeah, Laura, do you want to grab that one?
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to see if you wanted to comment first. So basically, it would be a Department of Code compliance issue. First of all, if they built without a permit, they'd be violating county code. And second of all, if they built in the HOD, they would be violating zoning regulations as a historic overlay district if adopted as part of the zoning ordinance. That would go with the part of code. That would go in the purview of the Department of Code compliance. They would consult with us on what happened, what went done. We have had after the fact approvals come in with Architectural Review Board, and they have approved them if they felt like they met the intent or modified them slightly. But it really does get to the level of Department of Code compliance and then elevating to the county attorney if it becomes a more drastic issue. So we haven't reached that point yet in one of our historic overlay districts, but that would be the process that would happen.
Okay, and Evelyn, did you get one more, or Lily, did you have something to add to that?
Yes, not to this one actually. I noticed that there was a follow-up to the height and grade question.
Okay. Yeah, do you want
um,
to?
Yeah, I just wanted to address that. So the question was that the problem is that with the grade of the land, if it's higher in the front of the home than the back of the home, then that issue of the building or the addition being higher than 35 feet. I wanted to clarify that grade actually is measured, especially for single family detached dwellings. It's the average ground level of ground level grade adjoining a building at all exterior walls. So we do take, especially for single family detached dwelling, the 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 lower average ground level at either the pre-existing or finished grade elevation that existed or is proposed at the time of building permit issuance. So there is a potential to have that split level or different height levels as it follows the grade around the exterior wall of the building. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Lily. Evelyn, is it? I think there was one more in the chat.
Yeah, there's one more. Is the architecture that will be mandated is the architecture that will be mandated modern or mid-century modern? What is the historic significance of the neighborhood that we are preserving?
So it's not going to be mandated specifically modern or mid-century modern. And no worries about coming in late. And so we started by using the National Register nomination and looking at what they determined the significance and why the area was historic. And we talked a little bit about it is mid-century modern kind of architecture, but we're going to make it, I don't want to say exactly specific to Holmes Run Acres, because obviously that would make it very strict and that's not our goal. So it will kind of have a lot of recommendations in the design guidelines for the kind of style part of that, and different ways that you can meet that. And so again, we don't want to freeze any of these houses in amber and make it that it only looks like it was in 1958. We want to make sure that you're able to add on as necessary, while still kind of meeting the characteristics of the neighborhood. And again, we haven't quite determined exactly what's going to go into the zoning ordinance or the design guidelines. And we will be reaching back out to everybody once we have those recommendations later on in the summer. So that way everyone can comment on that and make sure that we're kind of getting the point of the characteristics of the neighborhood. And
Nicole, oh, sorry, this is Laura. Jennifer Siegler, I think she's on the work group, wanted to add to your comment, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, please.
Okay, all right, I'll go ahead and unmute her.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Siegler, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't share my camera. I don't know who asked that question, but hello. We discussed this on a few occasions while we were considering contributing and non-contributing properties in the work group. It came up, are we trying to preserve mid-century modern or something specifically Holmes Run Acres modern? And I don't know that we really came to any kind of conclusion specifically for one of those three, because the issue that kept coming back in those conversations was we want to allow people to be creative, right? And that we've seen a lot of modern, not mid-century, but modern additions in the neighborhood that are very much in the spirit of Holmes Run. And so in that same sense that has been brought up several times already, that we're not trying to freeze this neighborhood in the past, I think that this is one of the ways where we don't define that it's either one or the other. We say Holmes Run is, there's a spirit to it and there's kind of a look to it and a feel to it. And it's probably going to change over time, even with a historic overlay district, and that's okay. And we didn't want to prevent that. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah, that's all I have to say.
No, I think that's great. Thank you. I will just mention too, if you go to our website, and again, I'll have the links up at the very end here. And you can also just go to the Fairfax County website at any time and search Holmes Run Acres. The first thing that comes up will be the website for this potential HOD. All of the work group meetings have been recorded and are on there. So if you, have nothing else to do during quarantine, feel free to go ahead and look at those. And there's usually a summary that goes along with them. So you should be able to, if you just want to read about what happened and what was discussed, and then decide to watch more. I got another question. Somebody said that the neighborhood was told on several occasions there would be a vote after the design guidelines process. The wording of the survey vote was not for an HOD, but for a survey. Are you saying now that there will not be a neighborhood vote to proceed or not to proceed? So I can't say for sure. I mean, if I think that the thought process is, and again, we haven't done this in a long time, so we're learning as we go. And I think that the staff and the supervisor's office will want to reach back out after the design guidelines. The draft ones are released later this summer. And obviously, I said there will be a community meeting, but my guess is that there will be other outreach, and that may include another survey. Whether or not that's a specific vote, I can't say specifically. And the part about the wording of the survey vote was not for an HOD, but for a survey. And I mentioned this briefly at the beginning. I think part of what gets a little bit lost in translation, and this is from us too, or for us, is that for staff, we're tasked by the board to evaluate the potential for a historic overlay district. And so that means what we're looking at is the historic significance. We're looking at what's contributing and non-contributing. And it makes it sound like we've decided, based on what we're talking about tonight, that, obviously there's a historic overlay district here. That's not the case. Yes, there's a National Register nomination. You guys are listed on the National Register. So we know that this neighborhood has, but that does not mean through this process, even if staff recommends a historic overlay district for the county, that means there is one. We are tasked, unfortunately, just with, I shouldn't say unfortunately, we're tasked with looking at what is there, what is the history there, what is the significance there. And with our background, we'll make a recommendation based on that. However, part of this process with the work group, and then again, these community meetings, and then eventually the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors, is also taking into account, obviously, the community concern, either for or against. So I don't want any of that to make it feel like, because we're saying, yes, this is contributing, and no, this isn't contributing, that somehow we've decided that there is a historic overlay district. This is part of the survey that I want to make sure that we know that nothing's been decided yet, and it won't be for a while. And then the next part of this question, on materials, Laura said we could recommend, but if you can't for financial reasons, that can be mitigated. Are you saying persons would need to justify a materials decision based on and/or demonstrate financial need? If not, what can override recommendations on materials? What if you prefer a material other than wood for maintenance reasons? Some conflicting information has been stated on the listserv concerning paint color. And what is the impact of a recommendation if the guidelines address these? And can a one-story house become a second story? That's a lot. Let me start back at the beginning real quick. So materials, yeah, everything's taken into account. Again, we can't require anything in the zoning ordinance from. Yes, if you have reasons, financial or otherwise, like you said, for maintenance, I know that the original roofs are problematic. Just because they're the original roofs, we're not going to say, hey, because they leak all the time, but they're original, you have to keep that original roof, even if you can afford it. That's not what this is about. We're going to give you recommendations in the design guidelines for, these are other options that would probably work well. And we'll continue to keep the character of the neighborhood, but it's not going to be, again, a requirement. So, and Laura, I don't know if you do want to say anything about the financial need.
The financial need was just an example of things that were taken into account. For example, we've had a couple, we had a historic overlay, a child care center and a historic overlay district, and they wanted to use Trex, which is a composite wood, rather than a pressure treated wood, rather than actual wood, because they were doing a child care. And so it didn't make sense, one, for them to keep replacing the wood, and that's what I meant by financial, or it didn't make sense for a maintenance purpose for them to do that. There are qualified architects on the architectural review board. I think we at least have 5 that are able to take those into account and be able to make recommendations on different types of materials that are out there that would still meet the intent and purpose of the historic overlay district, but meet also the applicant's needs.
Thanks, Laura. I'm just going to keep rolling, Evelyn. The next one I have is someone is confused about non-contributing. Will my non-contributing house be at a disadvantage with the ARB? No, not at all. They're going to still, if you want to put an addition onto it, they're still going to work within the design guidelines and the zoning regulations. They're not going to require something more extensive. They're going to have the same kind of process that they would have with somebody that would have a contributing structure. And so again, it's hard to say specifically. I think the further along we get in the process, the better we'll be able to answer like a specific question if your house is determined non-contributing. But no, it's in essence it's the same, but it will depend on your structure. And then I think Edith, so I think we're pretty much close to the end of the. Edith said she wanted to, Edith MacArthur wanted to make a comment about mid-century modern. Laura, are you able to unmute Edith?
Yes, hold on one second.
Okay, that's fine. And then after, since we're, I think, covered in the chat, if you do have something that you'd like to say, feel free to find your little hand thing and click on that, and we will work on getting you unmuted in order of hands raised. All right, thank you.
And Nicole, this is Laura. Just want to point out the time. It's 8:20 right now. I think we have until 8:30. Is that right, Nicole?
That's correct. And okay. As I mentioned earlier, if we don't get to questions, I'm going to put my contact information up at the end. We're going to take all the questions that we have in the chat and the ones that we get verbally, and we're going to create a document that we're going to post on our website, and we will send out to the work group to make sure we're getting all the community so everybody can see all the questions and all the answers that have happened tonight.
All right, Ms. MacArthur, you're unmuted.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just wanted to chime in because Jenny's right. We did talk a little bit at length about, are we looking to support HRA or mid-century modern? And I think it is really important to note that Homes Run Acres, by definition, was a neighborhood of starter homes, post-war starter homes. So unlike, let's say, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water or Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House or some of the other sort of Starchitecture mid-century modern homes, these very much took into consideration lower income starter homes, accessible to all. And I think that's a really important aspect of this neighborhood. You know, when I moved in 2 decades ago, there were still people who had purchased, and in fact, there still are a few, the original homes for the original dollars that they were somewhere in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. So these were not intended to be Tony homes. And as starter homes, they were also uniquely sited, almost every single one of them, into the landscape in a way that really dictates where you can effectively add. And it's different for each house. Some houses, even though the floor plates are pretty much the same, the layout is pretty much the same, even as you go through the different models, the Luria, Gaddy, and Bodor models, and they get increasingly larger with each of those models. The area where you can build out is almost dictated to you by the way the house meets the landscape. And I think that that's a really important aspect of these houses. And it's interesting, if you walk around the neighborhood, the additions that are more effective than others are the ones that take that into consideration. The ones that maybe aren't as effective are the ones that push up against that a little bit. So I think it's really important to understand that, you know, they took the architects who designed this and the Luria brothers who designed this, they took a mid-century modern aesthetic, which really was common to places like Arizona or California, which were flat, and they plunked it into a pretty hilly, I mean, Holmes Run Acres is flat on one side, I believe it was an old dairy farm, and then it's hilly on the other side, and the houses really changed. You can see the way they're sited, they really differ from each side of the neighborhood. So I think the siting dictates where to add, and I think that there's a commonality beyond the flat low pitch roof and the floor to ceiling glass, large chimney, and the other aspects that Nicole highlighted. And that is that there's a modesty of scale, and there's a keen awareness that this is a garden-like natural setting with houses nestled within, as opposed to most neighborhoods that are first house and then an afterthought of some greenery to kind of settle them in. And so what happens is, anytime you put up a fence or you put up a shed or you build an addition, you're taking away some of that green landscape and you're putting building down. And every time that happens, you're losing some of that garden-like setting. Now, we've benefited greatly from decades of that kind of additions, you know, not happening. And that's why we still have our garden-like setting. But all it would take is the beginnings of people saying, hey, these houses are, you know, half as big as I want. Let me double the volume on this. And pretty soon you would lose that natural landscape that we all love. So I think what's important about this historic overlay district is that the garden-like setting and whatever it takes to hold on to that is, I would say, you know, on par with the houses themselves. And that's what makes it a little bit trickier to dictate what exactly characterizes a Holmes Run Acres home, and also why it's possible, I would argue, to include some of the houses on Upper Executive that are not mid-century modern homes, but that nevertheless have the old growth landscape and have a modesty of scale. So, I mean, I think we have a challenge ahead of us, but I think if we don't use this tool, I think we will probably start to see a lot less green and a lot more building. And I feel like that would be really unfortunate, because at this point we have 350 homes in a garden-like setting, and it's a pretty significant neighborhood to try to hold on to. So I just wanted to just talk a little bit about why HRA is a little bit different than just pure mid-century modern, because there's another aspect to it. So I don't know if that helped.
Thank you, Edith. Oh, no, I think that's great. I think those are important points. And it's obviously stuff that we've talked about in the work group. And I think that anybody that lives in Holmes Run Acres appreciates and knows. So I'm going to say again, if we only have a couple minutes left, I know there's one more question here in the chat that we'd missed, and I'm going to get to that real quick. But if you do have your hand raised, we will try to get to you. And Laura, if anybody is unmuted, please, if you could mute them. I think we missed was whether a one-story can be modified into 2 stories. Yes, I think it will depend. Again, we haven't made any kind of determinations yet on, like I said, height limitations. We talked a little bit about that earlier. I think it would also depend on, and kind of touching on what Edith just said, it would depend on the structure that's there and also the landscape around it. And also, I think the question earlier about how it's being built into the landscape. So I think it would depend on all of those things. And as we continue to move forward in this process, we will try to understand that more. And then also in the zoning ordinance, a draft zoning ordinance and draft design guidelines, we'll try to make that very clear of what we think the best recommendations are. we'll present that back out to the public. So Laura, I can't remember who was supposed to be in charge of hands anymore. It's been so long. I don't see any hands
That would be
raised.
me, and there are none currently raised.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna just share my screen one more time. Oh, actually, Laura, if I'm gonna still back presenting, if I can. You might have to give it to me.
I'm going. Sorry.
Thank you. I know. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, there you go. There you go.
I'm an extrovert, so the more people I can see right now, the better. All right, 1 second. I do want to say real quickly as I'm doing this, thank you guys so much for getting on here. I know that it's, again, this is not the easiest way to do this, and I don't want to assume that we're capturing everybody, especially if we've had some issues with technology tonight. And so we will definitely work on making sure that we're reaching out. And again, we are still earlier in the process. Yes, we're in the research gathering phase. We're going to go back, kind of start making our determinations. We're going to reach back out to the work group here in the next our next meeting. We'll make sure that everybody knows when that is. And obviously you can listen in. And then obviously, please call me, send me questions to my email, visit our webpage. As I mentioned earlier, all of our previous work group meetings are online. There's a lot of documents that are associated with that. And I'm also working on other ways to make sure that questions and comments. I know there's some concern about how the community itself will decide whether or not there's a vote. And so, like I said earlier, I'm going to work with staff and the supervisor's office and see what the best way is to make sure that we're capturing the overall community concerns and this moving forward, especially once we get to the point of having a draft zoning ordinance and draft design guidelines. Unless there's anybody else staff-wise that you see in chats or anything, I just want to thank everybody so much for coming from us a lot, probably over the next so many months. So thank you so much.